Section 1 of the Athenian Empire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Pamela Nagami, MD. The Athenian Empire by George William Cox. Chapter 1. The Confederacy of Delos and the Foundation of the Athenian Empire, Part 1. The Persian Wars, of which the battles of Plataea and Mycale practically decided the issue, acquire their supreme importance as a struggle in which the spirit of voluntary obedience to law triumphed over the arbitrary rule of an irresponsible despot. This triumph was won by the inhabitants of a number of cities for whom independence meant generally little more than suspicion and jealousy of all other cities, breaking out not unfrequently into open war. But it was ensured, as Herodotus emphatically asserts, chiefly, if not wholly, by the skill, wisdom, and energy of the Athenians. Circumstances had indeed long been combining to give to Athenian policy a character essentially different from the narrow and short-sighted exclusiveness which ruled absolutely elsewhere. Had it not been for the wider and more generous aims of her great general Themistocles, the enterprise of Xerxes would, in the opinion of the historian, have assuredly ended in success. And but for the previous political education of the Athenian people, the career of Themistocles would have been an impossibility. Not 100 years had yet passed away from the time when Athens, still a comparatively insignificant city, seemed to lie beyond hope of deliverance under the yoke of the great Eupatrid houses. Shut out from all political power and placed by the rigid exclusiveness of caste under a ban which made their admission to such power a profanation, the main body of the people, without energy because without a purpose, submitted themselves to each faction as it gained ascendancy, or to the despot who availed himself of the rivalry of those factions to compass his own ends. So great was the danger involved in this apathy that Solon denounced the neutrality of citizens in the strife of contending factions as the worst of political crimes. But although his legislation had called into existence a class of peasant landowners, and by making wealth an indispensable condition for filling the highest offices in the state, had dealt a severe blow against the old social system, still his lessons and his warnings seemed for the moment to avail nothing. But when the tyranny of Pisistratus, and perhaps even more that of his sons, had brought home to them the dire mischiefs of irresponsible rule, the people, to whom Solon had at the least given a voice in the election of magistrates and the right of passing judgments upon them at the end of their term of office, threw themselves heart and soul into the designs and plans of Cleisthenes. These plans had for their object nothing less than the complete subversion of the Eupatrid theory, which regarded the enfranchisement of persons not belonging to the old religious tribes as an act of defiance against the gods, rather than as a mere resistance to oppressive rulers. By suffering these tribes to exist simply as religious societies, while he created a new set of tribes, taking in the whole free population of Attica, or possibly, as it is said, some also who were not free, he introduced a new order of things which was followed immediately by a marvellous wakening of popular energy, and within 15 years the people who had submitted to the despotism of the Pisistratidae dared to answer with a flat refusal the order of the Persian satrap Artaphernes, who charged them, if they valued their safety, to admit Hippias once more into Athens. But neither the reforms of Cleisthenes nor those of Solon assailed or weakened the conviction that the city was, and must be, that which the nation is for us, the ultimate unit of political society. Men on whom the Eupatrids looked down with contempt and disgust had now a share in making the laws which they obeyed, but no approach was made to the wider view which would look upon Spartans, Athenians, Thebans and Corinthians, as members of a single state with common interests and common duties. This mighty change was not to be accomplished for centuries, and when it should come, it was to be accomplished neither by any Greek city nor by the Hellenic people collectively. Yet for nearly 3 generations the world was to see a maritime empire, which seemed to give promise of effecting this beneficial consummation. And this empire was the direct and immediate result of the Persian Wars. The mere fact that the ruin of the Persian fleet and army brought the Athenians into new relations with the Asiatic Greeks and their former masters quickened at once their sense of duty and their promptitude in action. They were no longer dealing with matters affecting the independence of city communities, and the Spartans, far from being jealous of the influence which the Athenians must acquire, were for the time rather eager that others should undertake a responsibility which in plain terms they could scarcely with decency decline. With the consequences of their withdrawal they seem not to have concerned themselves, nor probably had the Athenian leaders any clear foresight of the jealousy and animosity which their maritime ascendancy would speedily awaken in Western Hellas. On one point alone Themistocles insisted with unshaken persistency, and this point was the paramount need of putting out the full powers of the Athenian state to secure to itself the dominion of the sea. The results of these efforts he was content to leave to the future. But in the meanwhile, the duties which the Athenian generals had to discharge were precisely those which would weaken in them the feelings of city exclusiveness, and rouse them insensibly to larger aims and a more generous policy. Having declined peremptorily the Spartan proposal to transfer the Asiatic Ionians to lands west of the Aegean Sea, they found themselves compelled to protect their ancient colonists against Persian tax gatherers; in other words, to set up and to maintain an orderly government with a hostile and watchful power in the rear. They were compelled to lay down rules to be obeyed by each member of the new alliance, to assign to them severally their places and their duties, and to see that none reaped the benefit of the new state of things without performing his own share in upholding it. They had to provide further for the administration of justice. Wrongs would be committed not only by the people of one allied city against the inhabitants of another, but by Athenian citizens against their new allies. For all such cases the aggrieved persons must have access to tribunals whose impartiality they should have no reason for calling in question, but more especially they must learn for themselves and enforce on others the great lesson that the common interests of large numbers of men can never be promoted except by the sacrifice of that independence which, if not curbed, runs into lawlessness, and that the voluntary restraint thus imposed is a real enlargement of freedom. In short, they were putting together the machinery of a great confederacy consisting of cities, some powerful, some insignificant, and their whole task raised them above the confined atmosphere of men intent on furthering only their own local interests. One of the first consequences of the work thus begun was a course of action which virtually set at naught the doctrine most precious to Greek statesmen generally. When once the new alliance was formed, the adhesion of the several members could no longer be a matter of choice. Whatever benefit must result from the Delian confederacy must of its very nature be shared by every Hellenic city on the western coasts of Asia Minor, and more particularly by all the inhabitants of the Aegean islands. No satrap must be suffered to vex the continental Greeks with his exactions. No Persian tribute ships must be permitted to enter the ports of the allies of Athens. These great ends could be attained only by the common efforts of all the Greeks who lay within the reach of the Persian power, and although the adhesion of these Greeks was in the first instance voluntary, the step was practically forced on all. In the eyes of their former masters they had sinned beyond forgiveness, and the only refuge open to them lay in the protection of that great city, without which, according to the emphatic assertion of Herodotus, the yoke of the oppressor would never have been broken. If, then, any members of this new confederacy should retain and exercise the right of quitting it at their own will, a gross injustice would be done not only to the Athenians, but to their nearer neighbours. The burdens needed to carry out the purposes of the new alliance must be borne. The money without which the work could not be done must be forthcoming, and if any repudiated or even shirked these duties, they would continue to share all the benefits of the confederacy, while they added to the toils and anxieties of those who remained faithful. It was not merely the duty, but the interest of Athens to secure these benefits as completely to the meanest as to the most important members of the confederacy, and these members must in their turn be taught that restrictions upon the independent action of individuals are indispensable in the interests of large societies, and that in the Delian alliance the position of the cities was pretty much that of the individual citizens of an autonomous town. This was a great lesson indeed, and unless some opposing force should counteract it, the inevitable result would in the end be the growth of a real Hellenic nation. Unfortunately, this opposing force, at no time lacking, was soon to be brought into violent action. While the Athenians were resolved to insist at all costs on the obedience of their allies to the rules, which they cheerfully obeyed themselves, it was no part of their plan to interfere with the internal arrangements of the confederate cities, nor in fact can such interference be at any time laid to their charge. But Aristides, like the Athenian statesmen of earlier generations, had felt instinctively that the growth of maritime enterprise must foster ideas fatal to the exclusive theories of the Eupatrid nobility, and by these the seafaring mob of the Piraeus was regarded as the seed-bed of democracy. The Athenian seamen now brought into direct contact with the citizens enrolled in the new confederation formed a natural intimacy with those whose political faith most nearly resembled their own. In other words, with the Democratic party, or as the oligarchs would term them, the Democratic faction or rabble in each city. The speedy result was the strengthening of democratic feeling to a degree which awakened the liveliest alarm in all cities where an oligarchy still retained power. And a new motive for secession was thus added to the more natural motives which gradually cooled the zeal of some who had been most earnest in the early days of the alliance. In these cities the oligarchs looked necessarily to Sparta, the supposed stronghold of Eupatrid intolerance, and Spartan dullness in discerning the shadows of coming events was more than compensated by the clear-sightedness of the Corinthians, who had now learnt the lesson preached to them in vain by the exiled tyrant Hippias. End of section 1. Section 2 of the Athenian Empire by Charles William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1, The Confederacy of Delos and the Foundation of the Athenian Empire, Part 2. There was, in truth, a general gravitation in the Greek cities to two distinct centres, the democratic citizens looking to Athens, the rest regarding themselves as the natural allies, if not the subjects, of Sparta. The fuel was thus prepared which might at any time be kindled into a fatal conflagration, and from the first it was certain that the conflict of these opposing principles must come, and would probably be not long delayed. 50 years, it is true, passed away after the overthrow of the Persians at Plataea and Mycale, before the antagonism between Sparta and Athens was brought to a head, and nearly 30 years more were needed for the demolition of the great fabric of Athenian empire. But practically this whole period of nearly 3 generations was spent in the efforts of oligarchical statesmen to upset and destroy a system which, as they felt, must be fatal to the autonomy of each separate Hellenic city. It cannot be said that their instinct deceived them. The only question is whether the empire of Athens was or was not more to the benefit of her allies than the supremacy of Sparta, and whether it might or might not in the end have welded the city communities of Greece into a nation. There are at least indications that such a result would have been achieved but for the sleepless animosity of the Corinthians and the more stolid hatred of the Spartans. At the outset there was little indeed to rouse the jealousy either of Sparta or of Corinth. Athens was little better than a heap of ashes. Its temples were burnt, its fields ravaged, its farm buildings taken down or demolished. A disaster affecting still more gravely the prosperity of the country was the departure of the metoikoi, or resident foreigners, who would not be persuaded to bring back their capital and their skilled workmanship to a land which could offer them no security either of person or of property. Without their wealth, it was impossible that the country could retrieve its losses, or that Athens should become supreme on the sea as Themistocles had determined that she should be. He saw, therefore, that nothing less than the adequate fortification of Athens could induce them to return, and he saw not less clearly that the true interests of the people would best be promoted by transferring the city from Athens to Piraeus, leaving the Acropolis to serve as the homes of the ancient gods, whose temples should be there maintained in fitting splendour. But neither now nor yet a little later, when he proposed the fortification of the Piraeus, could he venture in plain terms to propose the abandonment of the old city with all its time-honoured associations, and for the moment a serious difficulty seemed likely to hinder even the lesser enterprise of restoring the walls of Athens. Following the old type of Aryan civilization, the city of Sparta consisted of 4 unwalled hamlets, and with honest stupidity or with excellent craft, the Spartans now began to speak of walls as rather a luxury for robbers than a necessity for honest freemen. The fortifications of Thebes had done nothing but strengthen the hands of Xerxes or Mardonius, and the Corinthian isthmus could be made to serve as a screen for the defence of the whole peninsula, and therefore of all who might there seek a refuge. If such arguments were to be accepted, it was clear that the policy of all the extra Peloponnesian cities was to be directed by the chances of a Persian invasion of the Peloponnesus itself, nor was Themistocles a man to hesitate in condemning the unwarrantable tyranny which would enforce such a notion, or in ridiculing the stupidity which seemed to believe that the conditions of war must remain for ever unchanged. But at the moment he was compelled to be wary and measured in speech, and when the Spartans requested that the Athenians, instead of rebuilding their own walls, should join with them in dismantling the walls of all other cities to the north of the isthmus, he contented himself with taking no notice of the proposal, at the same time urging the Athenians to send him as ambassador to Sparta, but not to dispatch his colleagues until the walls had reached a height which would enable them to bid defiance to attack. In obedience to his earnest pleading, the work was carried on with the speed almost of magic, while Themistocles at Sparta expressed himself at a loss to understand why his colleagues failed to put in their appearance. When at length the irritation of the Spartans seemed to threaten serious consequences, Themistocles, again professing his ignorance, urged them to send envoys to Athens and satisfy themselves as to the facts. But he had taken care to ensure their detention, and he no sooner heard that they were in safe keeping than, throwing off the mask, he told them all that had been done, insisting that Athens had a full right to be girt about with walls, unless this right was to be denied to every city in the Peloponnesus. Anything like freedom of speech, he argued, would be impossible if any one city stood on a vantage ground with respect to the rest, and the allies of Athens must extend to her that freedom of action which, if thwarted by Athens, they would assuredly claim for themselves. But Themistocles felt that his work was still only half done, or rather that the most essential part of it was not even begun, so long as Athens was left without the direct protection of her navy. There was something almost absurd in claiming a maritime supremacy for a city the inhabitants of which had been compelled twice within the same year to leave their homes and seek a refuge elsewhere. The dominion of the sea would render any such disasters impossible. But if the old city could not, as he would have wished, be abandoned, the harbours on which it must depend for its future prosperity must be placed beyond reach of attack. According to this plan, the harbours of Piraeus and Munichia, the open waters of Phaleron he regarded as unsuitable for his purpose, were to be surrounded by a wall so strong and high that even in time of war old men and children should suffice to guard it. It was raised only to half the height which he had designed for it, but even thus his end was effectually attained. Everything was thus tending to place Athens amongst the foremost of Hellenic cities, and for the time everything seemed to disconcert the devices of her enemies. The Spartans were not easily stirred to active enterprise, and in their own generals they found the most effective hindrances to any schemes of pan-Hellenic supremacy, if we are to suppose that any such schemes had been formed. At Plataea, Pausanias, if we may believe the story, had expressed his amazement at the folly of the luxurious tyrant who cared to conquer a barren land and a hardy people. But even while he spoke he was, it would seem, dazzled by Persian wealth and enamoured of Persian pleasures. In any case, the fact of his treason is as little open to question as the traditional details of its execution are worthy of credit. There is no doubt that on the fall of Byzantium he sent to the Persian king the prisoners taken in the city, spreading the report that they had escaped. He forwarded at the same time, we are told, by the hand of the Eretrian Gongalos, a letter in which he informed Xerxes that he wished to marry his daughter and to make him lord of all Hellas, adding that with the king's aid he felt sure of success. The spirit of Cyrus or Darius would have been roused to rage at the presumption of the petty chief who aspired to an alliance with the royal house of Persia, on the score not of what he had done, but of what he hoped to be able to do by and by. The letter was certainly brief enough to come even from a Spartan, but it may certainly be set aside as spurious. Conspirators do not usually keep about their persons dangerous papers, when these papers are moreover quite unnecessary, and least of all would a Spartan conspirator be tempted to do so. If again we cannot suppose that Pausanias would keep copies of his own letters to the great king, it is altogether less likely that he would preserve the letters from the king, which, if discovered, must bring about his condemnation. The text of Thucydides contains, it has been said, copies of some of the letters addressed by Pausanias to Xerxes before the final missive which his Argilian slave, suspecting mischief to himself, placed in the hands of the ephors. This letter contained the charge that the bearer should be put to death. The letters carried by the previous bearers had contained, we are told, the same injunction. How then were the contents of these letters made known? They could be recovered only from the archives of Susa, and to the unlikelihood that such letters would be preserved at all must be added the far greater unlikelihood that they would ever be given up to the king's professed enemies. But further, there is no reason to suppose that Pausanias was himself able to write, and we may well ask where he could find a scribe so trusty as to be made acquainted not merely with his treacherous schemes, but with the injunction that the bearers of his letters should be put to death. In short, these letters, as we possess them, are forged, and the fact of their forgery has a most important bearing on the alleged conduct of a more illustrious man than Pausanias. But keeping ourselves for the present to the case of the Spartan general, we can scarcely help thinking that the gratitude of Xerxes was easily earned, if the deliverance of a few captives from Byzantion could wipe out the memory of the carnage at Plataea. However this may have been, reports reached Sparta that Pausanias, clothed in Persian garb, was aping the privacy of Oriental despots, and that when he came forth from his palace it was to make a royal progress through Thrace, surrounded by Median and Egyptian bodyguards. Recalled to Sparta and deprived of his command, he made his way again to Byzantion and established himself in a fortified position from which he was forcibly dislodged by the Athenians. But the Spartans, hearing that the victor of Plataea was busy hatching his treasons at Colonnae, sent a message bidding him to obey their summons on pain of being declared the enemy of the people in case of refusal. Whatever trust he may have placed in the kindly feelings of the Ephors, he had more confidence in the power of money, while he found even a better stronghold in Spartan law, which could trust nothing less than the actual confession of the prisoner. The facts thus far ascertained furnished nothing more than presumption against him, and even when his Argilian slave brought to the Ephors the letter which made death his recompense for the delivery of it, they could only advise him to take refuge in the Temenos, or sacred ground of Poseidon at Cape Teneron, in the hope that Pausanias, following his servant thither, might, in the hearing of some of the Ephors hidden between the double walls of the hut, say something to criminate himself. Their hope was not disappointed. Pausanias soon came to ask the Argilian why he had taken sanctuary. The slave retorted by asking what he had done to deserve the treachery which for his faithful service designed to reward him with death. Pledging himself solemnly that no harm should happen to him, if he would but depart at once on his errand to the Persian king, Pausanias made an admission of his guilt which satisfied the Ephors hidden behind the partition wall. But getting a hint of what was to happen, Pausanias in his turn took sanctuary at the shrine of Athena of the Brazen House, Chalkioikos, where, the roof being stripped off and the doors walled up, he was left to die of hunger. It cannot be said that he had more than a just recompense for treason of the blackest sort, but the religious feeling of the time was shocked by the violence which left a criminal to starve in a sanctuary, and a curse was supposed to cleave to all who had taken part in it. End of section 2. Section 3 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1: The Confederacy of Delos and the Foundation of the Athenian Empire, Part 3. The fate of Pausanias was more or less closely connected with that of Themistocles. It is perhaps enough to say that of his supposed complicity in the schemes of the Spartan general there is no evidence whatever. Nor after the death of Pausanias were any documents discovered which established the guilt of the great Athenian statesman. But the very splendour of his services had arrayed against him forces which could scarcely fail sooner or later to bear him down. The enthusiastic admiration of the Spartans had given place to feelings of dislike or even hatred after the diplomacy which had outwitted them during the rebuilding of the walls of Athens, and the influence of Sparta was at all times paramount with that faction or party of Athenian citizens who, even without external pressure, would be sure to regard Themistocles with extreme suspicion and dislike. No one man had ever done so much to strengthen the democratic element in the state. In other words, none had been more successful in lowering the ascendancy of the Eupatrid oligarchs. The animosity of these men, once roused, was sleepless and pertinacious. They could afford to work slowly, so long as they knew that they were working surely. They could first get rid of the obnoxious citizen, and then string together narratives of his alleged misdeeds, which, as time went on, would sufficiently blacken his memory, And although in the historian Thucydides, from whom comes practically our whole knowledge of the later career of Themistocles, we have a writer of unswerving honesty and of almost unwearying care in the sifting of evidence, we have in him also a man whose sympathies lay wholly with the aristocratic or oligarchic party. If again it cannot be said that Thucydides is strictly a contemporary historian when he writes about a man who died perhaps during the year which witnessed his own birth, it must further be remembered that the keenness of his scrutiny was directed to the examination rather of oral traditions than of written documents. In the case of the latter he was too much disposed to think that they must be what they profess to be, and we have already been obliged to dismiss as spurious some letters from Pausanias to the Persian king which he readily accepted as genuine. It is not to Thucydides, therefore, that we could look for a summing up from the point of view of democratic Athenian citizens, and it is therefore no slight thing if his narrative furnishes strong presumption that the stories circulated about Themistocles were one-sided and exaggerated, and in no small part groundless. It cannot, however, be denied that in Aristides the victor of Salamis had a rival formidable not only from the uprightness of his personal character, but from his wisdom in reading the signs of the times, and his promptness in acting in accordance with them. Before the invasion of Xerxes, Aristides had thrown the weight of his influence against that development of the Athenian navy which seemed to him likely to secure undue preponderance to the democratic element in the state. But the conduct of the people when the storm burst upon them convinced him that the lowest class of citizens, who by the constitution of Cleisthenes were left ineligible to the archonship, were not less deserving than the rest of filling the higher offices in the city, and he had the good sense to propose the abolition of a restriction which the excluded class would probably not long tolerate. If, as seems not unlikely, he was prepared for the further change which should determine the election of the archons by lot, this readiness in adapting himself to the times could not fail to extend his popularity, and thus to throw a larger measure of power into the hands of the oligarchic party in their struggle with Themistocles. This illustrious man was now accused of complicity in the schemes of Pausanias by some citizens who were bribed by the Spartans to bring the charge. But the time for their triumph had not yet come, and for the present Themistocles not only escaped, but was more popular than ever. Diodorus, it is true, speaks of his countrymen as forgetting his services and desiring his humiliation, partly through fear, partly through envy. But these feelings, it is obvious, could be entertained toward him only by those who took pride in their Eupatrid descent, and in corroboration of this belief Diodorus asserts distinctly that by the main body of the people he was still and always regarded with a singular love and affection. Nor is this fact in the least discredited by his ostracism in 471 B.C., which only proves that his absence from Athens appeared to 1/4 of the citizens a measure desirable in the interests of the city. Leaving Athens, he betook himself to Argos, but here the Spartans would not leave him undisturbed. By their means he was again charged with sharing in the treason of Pausanias, and hearing that orders had been issued for his arrest, he fled to Corcyra, and thence passed over into the country of the Molossian chief Admetos. In after years the story ran that, making his way after many difficulties and dangers to Ephesus, and journeying on thence into the interior, he sent to Artaxerxes, who had become king after the murder of his father Xerxes, a letter thus worded: "I, Themistocles, have come to thee, the man who has done most harm to thy house, while I was compelled to resist thy father, but who also did him most good by withholding the Greeks from destroying the bridge over the Hellespont while he was journeying from Attica to Asia. And now I am here, able to do thee much good. but persecuted by the Greeks on the score of my goodwill to thee. But I wish to tarry a year, and then to talk with thee about mine errand." The young king, we are told in this version of the tale, at once granted his request, and when at length, having thoroughly learnt the Persian language, Themistocles went to Susa, he acquired over Artaxerxes a prodigious influence, resting on the promise that he would make the Persian ruler monarch of all Hellas. Returning to Asia Minor, he spent the rest of his life in great magnificence, having the 3 cities of Magnesia, Myus, and Lampsakos to supply him with bread, wine, and vegetables, but doing nothing to fulfil his promise, until at length he died by a voluntary death to escape from an impossible task. The story refutes itself by asserting that nearly 20, or perhaps more than 20 years after the formation of the Delian confederacy, 2 cities, lying almost under the shadow of Mount Mycale, and a third on the shores of the Hellespont, at the very gate of the Propontis, could be made by a Persian king to furnish a revenue for his favourites. If he could bestow these towns as appanages, he might put any others along the Aegean coasts to the same use, and thus the work of the Greeks in destroying the fleets and the armies of Xerxes would have gone for nothing. If the resources of these towns were at the disposal of Artaxerxes, there was no reason why his tribute gatherers should not be seen in every Ionian city, and therefore no reason why his armies should not take ample vengeance for the revolt which followed the fight at Mycale. In short, if this story is to be believed, the account given of the assessment of Aristides in 477 B.C. must be summarily rejected. Fully 15 years earlier, the confederate leaders had been called upon to determine the proportions in which the allies should contribute men, ships, and money for the common cause. The sum total of this assessment on the allies amounted to 460 talents. The items are not given, but it seems to have been based on the amount of tribute which the cities on the eastern shores of the Aegean had paid to the Persian king. And thus, as the tribute for the nomos or district, which included the Ionians, Magnesians, Aeolians, Lycians, and some others, amounted to 400 talents in silver, the remainder would represent the contributions of the islanders. Yet here we have the inhabitants of certain towns assessed as members of the Delian confederation, still at the beck and call of the Persian despot, and we are left to wonder what the allies had done during the long period of some 20 years toward breaking the yoke which Cyrus had placed on the necks of the Hellenic subjects of Croesus. Long ago, when Pausanias was hatching his treasons, Spartan authority was able to reach him at Colonnae in the Troad, and he felt himself constrained to obey the messenger who bade him follow on pain of being declared the enemy of the people if he should refuse. But now, spending years of luxurious ease at Magnesia, Themistocles could bid defiance to his countrymen, whose order for his arrest had, as we have seen, driven him away from Argos. Thus at the outset we find ourselves dealing with a story open to the gravest suspicion, and this suspicion must be increased when we learn that in another version the Persian king, far from regarding Themistocles as a benefactor to the royal house, had put a price of 200 talents upon his head, and that Themistocles was accordingly unable to reach Susa except in the disguise of a stranger designed for the king's harem. Other stories were told which represented Mandane, the sister of Xerxes, as demanding him for the indulgence of the savage vengeance of Eastern peoples, and which spoke of Themistocles as escaping only through his singular ease in the use of the Persian language. End of section 3. Section 4 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1. The Confederacy of Delos and the Foundation of the Athenian Empire, Part 4. Nor is it enough to note merely that the vast wealth which Themistocles is said to have carried away with him into exile renders superfluous the bribes for which he pledged his services to the Persian despot. No judgment passed on his supposed conduct during his later years can have a claim on our consideration unless it surveys his whole career. The faculties which concentrate all the powers of a man on one especial purpose are just those which leave the least chance of a radical change in more advanced life, and for this fixity of purpose no man has ever been more remarkable than Themistocles. So mighty had been the impulse which he imparted to Athenian enterprise, so completely had it strengthened the Athenian character, that his great rival, as we have seen, gave his aid in the working of that maritime policy the introduction of which he had opposed. In this business of his life he had displayed a rapidity of perception which gave to his maturest judgments the appearance of intuition, a fertility of resource, and a readiness in action which were more than equal to every emergency. He had kept those about him in some degree true to the common cause, when a blind and stupid terror seemed to make all possibility of union hopeless. Yet of this man the traditional history would have us believe, not that he yielded to some mean temptation, not that he began his career in poverty and ended it in wealth, but that from the beginning he distinctly contemplated the prospect of destroying the house which he was building up, and of seeking a home in the palace of the king, on whose power and hopes he was first to inflict a deadly blow. We are told that at the very time when, by an unparalleled energy of character and fixity of purpose, he was driving the allies into a battle which they dreaded, he was sending to the Persian king a message which might stand him in good stead when he should himself come as a suppliant to the court of Susa, and that he deceived his enemy to his ruin in order to win his favour in the time of trouble which he knew to be coming. We are yet further asked to believe that in the Persian palace he actually found the refuge which he contemplated, that his claim to favour was admitted without question, that he pledged himself to enslave his country, and for 12 or 14 years received the revenues of large towns to enable him to fulfil his word, and yet that during this whole time he made not a single effort to fulfil even a part of his promise to the Persian king. When we look further into the case, we find that the Spartans merely spoke of the proofs which had satisfied them of the complicity of Themistocles in the treason of Pausanias. We are not told that they exhibited these proofs to the Athenians, or that they could be exhibited. And if the genuineness of the letter entrusted to the Argilian slave be granted, this only proves the spuriousness of the previous letters in which Pausanias expressed his desire to marry the daughter of Xerxes, and shows still more clearly that the letter of Themistocles, placed in the hands of Thucydides, is a forgery. In short, there is nothing in the case of Pausanias which will help us to any conclusion in that of Themistocles. The work of the former was ended on the field of Plataea. The mind of Themistocles, after the victory of Salamis, was turned to the harder task of building up the Athenian confederacy and of imparting something like a fixed principle of union to a mass of atoms which were at any time ready to fly asunder. For Pausanias' withdrawal from command meant a return to the life of a mere citizen, in a place where he felt that he ought to be king, and to a rigid and monotonous routine which to him had manifestly become intolerably irksome. Conscious of possessing not merely the esteem, but the love of the main body of his countrymen, Themistocles had in Athens everything that could make life worth living for: the sense that a great future lay before the state which he had saved from ruin, and that the coming empire of Athens was in great part his own work. Nor must we forget for a moment that this work needed the fullest concentration of mind and will. It was one which had to be carried out in the face of overpowering difficulties, and which a divided heart and wavering purpose could never have accomplished. Nor do the charges of bribery brought against him furnish much presumption of his guilt. Beyond the sums which he is said to have bestowed on the Spartan and Corinthian leaders, We are not told that he made any use of the money given to him by the Euboeans, although we might well suppose that a bribe would have turned the scale in more than one emergency. In these instances the corruption lay with the recipients of the bribe, not with Themistocles, who never swerved in his purpose, and the other charges brought against him of extorting money for his private use from the Aegean islanders may be fairly set aside as unproven, if not as false. With his messages to Xerxes before and after the Battle of Salamis we may deal not less summarily. If the first was sent, it was superfluous except as a device for hastening on a battle which Xerxes had no intention of declining, or perhaps even of delaying. The second would have been regarded by the despot as a stupid and malicious trick, while if we look upon it as a device for securing himself a home when he should have turned traitor, it compels us to believe that a man engaged in saving his country from dangers seemingly overwhelming, and struggling with the jealousy, the selfishness, or the disaffection of his colleagues, was actuated at one and the same moment by two entirely distinct and conflicting motives. Bent on setting his country free, he was, on this hypothesis, not less bent on securing a place of retreat among the very enemies whom he was driving out. The idea is ludicrous. Such a condition of mind could assuredly have produced nothing but distraction of purpose and weakness in action, a turmoil of contrary desires with which the calm judgment and the profound energy of the man stood out in incomprehensible contrast. Of the treachery thus imputed to him we may perhaps form some notion if we should suppose that before the fight of Trafalgar Nelson had already done his best to secure the goodwill of the tyrant Bonaparte, whose fleets he was advancing to encounter. In short, wherever we turn, we are met by inconsistent or contradictory statements, by shadowy inferences or unwarranted assumptions. We may take the two letters in which Pausanias and Themistocles respectively make their overtures to the great king. The former may have been too presuming and boastful to be altogether agreeable to an Eastern monarch, but it was at least free from the falsehoods which form the substance of the letter of Themistocles. The plea that the instinct of self-preservation alone had led him to resist and repel the invasion of Xerxes must to his son Artaxerxes, who could not be altogether ignorant of the phenomenon of Medeism, have appeared not less ridiculous than false. The boast that as soon as he could safely do so he had compensated his injuries with greater benefits must have seemed an extravagant and wanton lie. More than any other man he had toiled to destroy the Persian fleets and armies, and even to ruin the Persian Empire by raising up against it the most formidable confederacy which it had ever encountered. For any good service done by him to the Persians we shall assuredly look in vain. It is useless to go further. It is just possible, though most unlikely, that some sort of agreement may have been made by him with Artaxerxes, but the terms of it we shall never discover. It is enough to know that no definite results followed, and we may therefore safely infer that it pledged him to no direct enterprise against the freedom of Athens or of Hellas. The story of his suicide was disbelieved by Thucydides. By Diodorus it was regarded as a crowning stratagem to prevent all further attempts on the part of the Persians against Greece. That Themistocles, had he chosen, might have inflicted great damage on the growing empire of Athens we cannot for a moment doubt. That not a single injurious act can be alleged against him proves not that he cheated the king by a train of gratuitous falsehoods extended over a long series of years, but that Artaxerxes imposed no such obligations as the price of his hospitality. We are thus brought to the conclusion that from first to last Themistocles well deserved the warm affection which his countrymen generally felt for him during his life, and with which they honoured his memory after his death. That his ostracism was due to the exertions of the oligarchic party, stimulated by the menaces or the bribes of the Spartans. That the order for his arrest which made him fly from Argos, was in like manner the result of Spartan intrigues acting on the animosity felt toward him by his personal enemies, that in his absence those enemies strung together those slanders which could be most readily propagated by the oligarchic factions in every city, and that these reports, in the course of 30 or 40 years, were worked into the shape of the traditional narrative preserved to us by Thucydides. We may well feel a legitimate satisfaction in this result of an inquiry which acquits the greatest of Athenian statesmen not merely of treason, but of any attempt to injure his country, and exhibits the Athenian Empire as a fabric raised by men whose moral consistency may command our respect, while their political sagacity must win our admiration. End of section 4. Section 5 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1, The Confederacy of Delos and the Foundation of the Athenian Empire, Part 5. If, then, there is no evidence that Themistocles desired and deliberately pledged himself to undo the work of his life, we may well suppose that he regarded the rapid growth of Athenian power with mingled exultation and pride. Anger and resentment he may or must have felt, but these feelings would have for their object only that party among his countrymen whose enmity persistently followed him, not the main body of the people by whom he knew himself to be beloved. The obstacles to be surmounted, even when the Persian fleet had been ruined at Mycale, were formidable indeed. The story which represents Artaxerxes as giving 3 Hellenic cities to Themistocles may be absurd, because it attributes to him the absolute ownership of a vast territory in which, at best, he could have possessed only a few military strongholds. Probably by that time he retained not a single post in that long and beautiful strip of land which had formed the brightest jewel in the crown of the Lydian kings. But 15 or 20 years earlier it was found to be a hard, in some instances an impossible task, to dislodge the Persian garrisons from the cities which they occupied, and Doriscos, where Xerxes had reviewed his mighty force, was still in the hands of a Persian governor when Herodotus was composing the later books of his history. The carrying on of the struggle must, in short, involve a serious strain for those who might persevere in it, and Sparta felt neither bound nor inclined to incur it. The Asiatic Greeks on their side were not slow to perceive the real state of Spartan feelings, and when the Spartan commissioners headed by Dorcas came to supersede Pausanias, they were met by a passive resistance which made them still more anxious to be rid of a costly and unprofitable duty. With Athens the case was in every way different. In reliance on her earnestness and her power to help them, the Asiatic Hellenes were again in revolt against the Persian king. Nor could she fail to see that interest and duty alike called her to place herself at the head of the cities which were willing to submit to her guidance while they rejected the supremacy of Sparta. The whole history of the war had made it clear that her power, as Themistocles had insisted, was based upon her fleet, and that this power was capable of indefinite expansion. The security of Attica, which was bringing back to the city the wealthy and skilled population of alien residents, could be maintained only by her command of the sea, and this command secured further the benefits arising from the whole commerce of the Aegean, together with the trade, chiefly in corn, which streamed from the Black Sea through the gates of the Hellespont. So wonderful was the progress made, and so great was the ambition roused by this success, that Athenian statesmen began to dream of a land empire for their city, not less brilliant than their supremacy at sea. But Themistocles assuredly never supposed that within a few years the power of Athens would extend from the harbours of Megara to the pass of Thermopylae, and if he could have foreseen it, he would have deprecated these conquests as mischievous, if not fatal, to her real interests. The fact that Delos was chosen as the centre of the new confederacy is sufficient proof that no such schemes were at the time entertained by others. The events which led to these results were shaped by circumstances which could not have been anticipated, but of the course of these events we have unfortunately a singular bare and meagre record. It is not that the history of this important time has been lost, but that it never was written. From Thucydides we learn that the confederacy of Delos was at first an association of independent states whose representatives met in the synod on terms of perfect equality, but that 10 years later a change became manifest in the attitude of Athens toward her allies, that at first all contributed ships and men for the common service, whether with or without further contributions in money, and that the change in the relative positions of Athens and her allies was brought about wholly by the acts of the latter. It was absolutely necessary in the presence of a common danger that these should faithfully keep to their engagements. It was not less necessary that Athens should compel them to the performance of their duty in case of slackness or of failure. But with the Ionians it was the old story. The Athenians were for them hard taskmasters only because they hated the very idea of long-continued strenuous exertion. But they were dealing now with men who were not to be treated like the Phocian Dionysios in the days of Aristagoras, and as in some shape or other they must bear their full measure of the general burden, the thought struck them that their end might be gained if they paid more money and furnished fewer ships and men or none. Their proposal was accepted, and its immediate result was to enhance enormously the power of Athens, while in case of revolt they became practically helpless against the thoroughly disciplined and resolute enemy. To this end they were rapidly hastening, and the measure in which they were freed from the fear of Persian exactions marked the degree of their impatience under a confederation of which they felt themselves to be no longer voluntary members. With this change of feeling, the Delian synod was doomed. Its members could no longer meet as equals, its deliberations became a mere waste of time, and Delos was obviously no longer a fit place for the common treasury. Hence the synod ceased to meet, and the funds were transferred to Athens. The days of the Athenian hegemony or leadership were now ended. The empire of Athens had begun, and neither in laying its foundations nor in raising the fabric can the Athenians be charged with any lack of promptitude. The victory of Cimon in 466 B.C. destroyed, it is said, on one and the same day at the mouth of the Eurymedon in Pamphylia, the Phoenician fleet of 200 ships and the land forces with which it was destined to cooperate. Not many months later, a quarrel with the Thasians about their mines and trade on their Thracian settlements ended in open war. Not content with blockading Thasos, the Athenians in 465 B.C. sent 10,000 men as settlers to the spot called the Nine Roads, the site of the future Amphipolis. But these, advancing rashly into the inner country, were cut to pieces by the Edonians, to whom the Milesian Aristagoras had fallen a victim. Undismayed by this disaster, the Athenians in 463 B.C. still blockaded the Thasian port. The siege had lasted 2 years when the Thasians resolved to ask aid from Sparta. They saw that the quarrel between themselves and the Athenians was one which must be decided in a struggle between the two foremost cities of Hellas, and the readiness with which the Spartans entered into a secret engagement to invade Attica proves that, apart from the specific causes of offence, the mere greatness of Athens was a wrong which they could not forgive, and that they had advanced not a step beyond the narrow exclusiveness of the old Aryan civilization. To this fear and consequent hatred of Athens, and to this alone, we must trace the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War. But for the present their power to aid the Thasians was not equal to their will, and the Thasians, subdued at last, were compelled to pull down their walls, to give up their ships and their Thracian settlements, and to make up the contributions which they would have paid if they had not revolted. The inability of the Spartans to invade Attica arose from a revolt of the Helots, who construed an earthquake which followed the death of Pausanias as a sign calling upon them to rise against their masters. The insurgents were shut up in the old Messenian stronghold of Ithome, and the Greeks, always at a loss in siege operations, in 464 B.C. besought the help of the Athenians, against whom they had made a secret pact with the Thasians. This petition was warmly seconded by Cimon, the winner of the double victory at Eurymedon, who prayed his countrymen not to suffer Hellas to be lamed of one leg, or Athens to draw the cart without her yoke partner. Cimon himself, sent with an Athenian army, failed to carry Ithome by assault, and was dismissed by the Spartans on the plea that they had no further need of his services. Conscious of their own premeditated treachery, they imputed the same double dealing to the Athenians. But they miscalculated the effect of this insult. The indignant Demas at once proposed an alliance to the Argives, who eagerly welcomed it as a means of recovering their old supremacy in the Peloponnesus. Megara, at the same time, tired out with Corinthian encroachments on her boundaries, flung herself into the arms of Athens, which thus became possessed of the two Megarian ports, Nisaea on the Saronic Gulf and Pegae on that of Corinth, while her possession of the passes of Geronea rendered Spartan invasion of Attica practically impossible. Still further to strengthen their hold on Megara, the Athenians joined the city by long walls to its southern port of Nisaea, and within the fortress thus made they placed a permanent garrison. End of section 5. Section 6 of the Athenian Empire by George William Cox. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1. The Confederacy of Delos and the Foundation of the Athenian Empire, Part 6. This enrollment of Megara in the new league, to which the Thessalians were also admitted, roused the fiercest wrath of the Corinthians and of their allies Epidaurus and Aegina. A defeat of the Corinthians made the Aeginetans resolve on measuring their full strength with the men who had robbed them of their ancient maritime supremacy. They went into battle, relying on the tactics which had proved successful against the Persians at Salamis and Mycale. They came out of it ruined as a maritime power, and dreading Athenian strategy as much as they dreaded the fleets of Xerxes 22 years before. The island was strictly blockaded, and the Spartans had thus another opportunity for striking a blow at Athens, while her forces were busied elsewhere. But the Helots were not yet subdued, and they were obliged to refuse help not only to the Aeginetans, but also to a Persian envoy who prayed them to invade Attica in order to draw off a large Athenian force which had been sent to aid the Egyptians in their revolt against Artaxerxes. In truth, the history of this time, with its rush of events and its startling changes, exhibits on the Athenian side a picture of astonishing and almost preternatural energy. One army was besieging Aegina, another was in Egypt, and yet this was the time chosen by Pericles for carrying out at home the plan which on a small scale had been adopted at Megara. To join Athens with Piraeus on the one side and Phaleron on the other, one wall was needed of about 4.5, and another of about 4 English miles in length. Such an enterprise could not fail to exasperate the fears and jealousy of the Spartans, and to alarm the conservative statesmen of Athens, who were especially anxious to keep on good terms with Sparta. But it was a necessary result of the policy of Themistocles, and it became evident to the Spartans that if the growth of Athens was to be arrested, it could be done only by setting up a counterpoise to her influence in northern Hellas. Hence, in order to check Athens, they swallowed down their horror of organized federations and set to work to restore the supremacy of the Boeotian city, which had been most disgracefully zealous in the cause of Xerxes. The Spartan force sent across the Corinthian Gulf defeated the Athenians at Tanagra, within sight of the Euripus, and returned home through the passes of Geronea. 2 months later, the Athenian Myronides marched into Boeotia, and by his splendid victory in the vineyards of Oinophyta, raised the empire of Athens to the greatest height which it ever reached. The Boeotians and Phocians became the subject allies of the Athenians, the natural consequence being that in each city the demos rose to power and drove out the oligarchic party. This great success, which made Athens supreme from the harbours of Megara to the passes of Thermopylae, was followed by the humbling of Aegina in 455 BC. The walls of this ill-fated city were razed, and her fleet was taken away, while a tribute was imposed on her for the maintenance of the Athenian confederacy. But the enterprises undertaken by the Athenians at this time were by no means attended with uniform success. The fact to be chiefly noted is the energy which remained undiminished even by serious reverses. Of these reverses, the most terrible was the disaster which deprived them of the whole fleet sent to help the Egyptians in their revolt against the Persians. But even this great catastrophe was in some measure compensated by the event which enabled them in 452 BC to place at the entrance of the Corinthian Gulf a population bitterly hostile to the Spartans. After a gallant resistance of 9 years, the Helots in Ithome were obliged to surrender on condition of departing forthwith from the Peloponnesus. The Athenians offered them a refuge in Naupactus, and in the expelled Messenians they found always the most trusty and devoted allies. 3 years later, the Spartans, by making a truce for 5 years, enabled the Athenians to turn their whole mind to operations against the Persian king. The carrying out of this was the great work of Cimon's life. At home, his influence was waning before the ascendancy of Pericles. At the head of a fleet, he might not only strike fresh terror into an enemy often already defeated, but enrich both his country and himself. We may be sure, therefore, that he went out on a welcome errand, when in 450 BC, with 200 ships, he sailed for Cyprus. But we have from Thucydides only a few sentences which tell us that while he was blockading Kition, Cimon died, and that the Athenians, compelled to abandon the siege from lack of food, won a victory both by land and sea over the Phoenicians and Cilicians. Later historians tell us that the Persian king, dismayed at the long run of ill luck which attended his arms, sent to Athens ambassadors charged with proposals for peace, and that the Athenians in their turn sent Callias to Susa, and through him concluded the treaty which bears his name. By this convention the Persian king, it is said, bound himself to send no ships of war beyond the eastern promontory of Lycia, and to respect the Thracian Bosphorus as the entrance to Hellenic waters. The reality of this treaty has been called into question by the fact that it is unnoticed by Thucydides, although by the orators of a later generation it was regarded as among the most splendid of the Athenian achievements. The explanation of this seeming inconsistency may perhaps be found in the fact that the convention wrought no change and simply gave a formal sanction to arrangements which, under existing circumstances, seemed advantageous to both parties. To the Athenians living at the time, the treaty was in itself of so slight importance as to be scarcely deserving of notice. To those of later generations, it became the evidence of political conditions which had become things of the past, and to which they looked back with a jealous and sensitive pride. Athens had thus reached the zenith of her greatness, not by an unbroken series of victories, but by the persistent resolution which will draw from success the utmost possible encouragement, while it refuses to bend even beneath great disasters. On a foundation of shifting and uncertain materials, she had raised the fabric of a great empire, and she had done this by compelling the several members of her confederation to work together for a common end. In other words, to sacrifice their independence, so far as the sacrifice might be needed, and refusal on their part had been followed by prompt and summary chastisement. She was indeed offending throughout, and offending fatally, the profoundest instinct of the Hellenic mind, that instinct which had been impressed on it in the very infancy of Aryan civilization. Whatever might be the theories of her philosophers or the language of her statesmen, Athens was doing violence to the sentiment which regarded the city as the ultimate unit of society. And of this feeling Sparta availed herself in order to break up the league which threatened to make her insignificant by land, as it had practically deprived her of all power by sea. The temper of Sparta was indeed sufficiently shown in her readiness to restore to her ancient dignity the city which had been most zealous in the cause of Xerxes. The designs of Athens were manifested by the substitution of democracy for oligarchy in the cities subjected to her rule. These changes, it is obvious, could not be accomplished without the expulsion of the Eupatrid citizens who might refuse to accept the new state of things. And as few of them were prepared to accept it, a formidable body of exiles, furious in their hatred of Athens, was scattered through Hellas, and was busily occupied near home in schemes for upsetting the new constitution. In 447, 9 years after the Battle of Oinophyta, the storm burst on the shores of Lake Copias. A battle fought at Coronea ended in a ruinous defeat for the Athenians, those who survived the battle being for the most part taken prisoners. Roman feeling would probably have left these unhappy men to their fate, as it refused to ransom the prisoners taken by Hannibal at Cannae. The Athenians were more humane, or could less afford thus to drain their strength, and to recover these prisoners they made no less a sacrifice than the evacuation of Boeotia, the immediate consequence being the return of all the exiles to the several cities and the restoration of the ancient oligarchies. Of this change, the revolt of Euboea in 446 BC was the natural fruit, but scarcely had Pericles landed with an Athenian army on the island when the more terrible tidings reached them that the Megarians, renouncing their alliance, had massacred the Athenian garrison within the long walls, and that a Spartan army was ravaging the fertile lands of Eleusis and Threus on Attic territory. Unappalled by these dangers, Pericles returned hastily from Euboea, and after the departure of the Peloponnesians, brought about, as some said, by bribes, went back to the island, which he subdued thoroughly. The Athenian spirit, it was clear, was as vigorous as ever, but it was also certain that the idea of an Athenian empire by land must be classed in the ranks of dreams which are never to be realized. Her hold on the Peloponnesus was to all intents already gone, although she still held the 2 ports of Megara, and hence, like the alleged treaty of Callias, the truce of 30 years in 444 BC, which followed the reconquest of Euboea, gave only a formal sanction to certain accomplished facts. As things had now gone, the Athenians gave up little when they surrendered Troezen and Achaea, together with the Megarian harbours. But it was easier to evacuate Megara than to forgive the Megarians, to whom 10 years of friendship had given the power of inflicting a deadly blow on the imperial city, with which of their own free will they had allied themselves. During all that time Athens had done them no wrong, and had conferred on them many benefits. No changes in Megara are known to us which might account for this sudden desertion. For some unexplained reason they abandoned the alliance which they had so eagerly embraced, and they roused in the Athenian mind a feeling of hatred which exacted a stern vengeance in after years. End of section 6.